So while we remember the victims of the Marikana Massacre, this year also marks the centenary of the Rand Revolt. The University of Johannesburg has actually hosted a commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the Marikana Massacre under the theme Respect and Retrospect. That event drew connections between the deadly events of March 1922 and those of August 2012. So let's discuss this further. Bring in UJ Professor of Sociology and author of Marikana, A View from the Mountain. That's Professor Kate Alexander, who joins us via our video link this morning. Prof, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for your time and indeed your patience. I mean, when we talk about the Rand Revolt and what took place today in Marikana, what are some of the uncanny similarities that come up for you, and what lessons do you reckon that offers?
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be with you and with your viewers. Yeah, it was really fascinating to discover that right by the university was the main site of the battles, the violence in the Rand Revolt of 1922, when white miners went on strike. They were on strike for better pay to preserve their jobs. So they were also suffering from the way in which they were being treated by their employers, by the mining capitalists. And as with Marikana, they had the support of the state, then under Prime Minister Smuts, and they suffered terrible conditions. They were on the Brixton Ridge, at a place called Frederick Copy. It was a very similar kind of situation to the one at Marikana, where workers were looking out to see what was happening around them. And eventually they were attacked by aircraft, by heavy artillery, and then by an invasion up the ridge by the police. And about 1,500 of them were arrested. So in that sense, it was very similar. What struck us all was the similarity between a situation where the employers were not making enough profit and decided to attack workers, and the situation at Marikana.
Yeah, and in both instances, again, it was state-sanctioned violence, as what it's called now, that actually led to the mass deaths of miners.
Yes, that's quite right. And I think there's no doubt about that in terms of Marikana. If one goes through the events following the details in the Farlam Commission report, for instance, one can see, and Farlam is absolutely straightforward about it, that the decision to use lethal force on the 16th was taken at a meeting on the 15th, a meeting between the commissioner and provincial commissioners and a few people from the head office. That's where it was decided to use the force.
You know, typically there's that cliche about us needing to learn from history. I mean, these two moments being significant in this way today suggests that perhaps as a country we don't do that, especially when you consider just how much the state and more specifically police struggle to respond to protests that typically turn violent. I wonder, in your own reflections, what comes up insofar as that is concerned?
Well, indeed, the police were involved in 1922. There were special police, and in fact, they were stationed on my own campus. But the main forces were the army and the air force, and also the government managed to mobilize a citizen force of people from the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. So this was straightforward class warfare against white mine workers. At that time, it was more complicated. The employers had decided to sack 2,000 of the 22,000 white mine workers who were employed, and they wanted to replace them with black workers. So this was a very difficult situation, and during the long strike lasted about 12 weeks. There was increased racial tension, and some of the white miners killed black people around Johannesburg. The mine leadership tried to stop them, but it nevertheless happened. So this is a reminder of the brutality of apartheid and the way in which it affected white workers. So there was a division of opinion amongst white workers. But that was not the key issue about 1922. The key issue about 1922 was this ongoing conflict between capital and workers, capital wanting to increase their profits, and workers wanting to protect their position.
Which is still the critique against mining bosses today, quite frankly, especially when you look at the income inequality that exists among the executives, who often, will sit in their offices, and blue-collar workers who are underground, often at a great risk to their lives. Speaking about that,
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps you want to weigh in on that.
No, not at all. I was just going to say
Yeah.
you're absolutely right about that.
Sure. And speaking about that, I mean, it does also bring into sharp focus discussions around the conditions of blue-collar workers in our country that typically lead to the kind of protests that we've seen, not only back in 1922, but also in 2012, and more recently, even perhaps this year.
Yes, that's quite right, particularly on the mines, because the job is so dangerous. Whenever you talk to mine workers, it's the key issue that they raise. So it's not just that the work is very arduous, which it is in the mines, particularly, for instance, for rock drill operators. And it always strikes me that when I meet mine workers and they come to our meetings, they're very hungry, because they're burning up so many calories. So it's a very arduous job, it's a very dangerous job, it's not a well-paid job. We don't treat our mine workers with proper respect. You mentioned earlier the owners of the mines. I remember just after the terrible massacre 10 years ago, one of the top CEOs still saying that these are just migrant labourers. You know, they come from the rural areas and we shouldn't have to pay them so much. Now, these are people who should be treated with respect and with dignity, who have to maintain families, often more than one family, usually more than one family, because they have a wife or a girlfriend close to the mine and one back in the rural areas. I've interviewed people who've got more families to look after. So their living conditions are often worse than those of ordinary workers. But I agree with you completely about the situation with manual workers, particularly unskilled, semi-skilled manual workers, and people are angry. I mean,
Sure.
you know, I do a lot of interviews with workers, attend quite a lot of meetings. We had a meeting yesterday with young unemployed people whose conditions were awful, and they're very angry. And this is why they're beginning to mobilise again against the government in particular, because the government provides a central focus for their concerns. And this issue of people being paid 350 Rand a month, I mean, it's really impossible to think how you can live on that. And of course, some people aren't even getting that amount of money at the moment for all sorts of reasons. So the trouble is really brewing. And as you probably know, that SAFTA, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, with its community supporters in the Working Class Summit, are calling for a day of action. And we'll have to see how well that's supported. But there's no doubt that the anger is there, and the desire for people to stick together in solidarity with each other is present, just as it was in Marikana 10 years ago.
Yeah, it reminds you of what's contained in some classical sociology texts about the proletariat one day rising against the bourgeoisie and no one benefiting from that. But as a sociologist in this space who's interested in these dynamics, what do you reckon it will take to change the situation? Because on the one hand, we're told by some of the mining bosses that that's just how capitalism works and they alone won't be able to shift the dial. Do they have a point? Should the state get involved?
Well, first of all, let me go back to your assertion. I'm really pleased that you've read sociology, but of course it depends on the balance of class forces, who benefits from particular strikes. Where workers win a strike, they can defend gains that they may have made in the past. If they lose, then their conditions are made worse. In Marikana, workers in 2012 were involved in a struggle about their pay, which continued to 2014. They were demanding 12,500 Rand, if you remember that, and eventually made considerable advances. So in economic terms, people can improve their positions if they win in strikes, and it's very important for workers to participate in trade unions and to engage in action against their employers. So there are those possibilities for improvement. With regard to the bigger picture, I think capitalism is a complete mess. Nobody knows what to do about it amongst the politicians. They seem to want to carry on as usual, and as usual means that people are now suffering from malnutrition. So the important thing here, just as in a wage dispute, is for people to organise, but because this is a general, national and indeed international issue, people have to organise in a broader way across their trade unions and in class terms, because this is a class issue, have to organise much more broadly to make sure that people have jobs, have food in their stomachs, and can protect themselves from all sorts of terrible things that are happening at the moment. I've been doing research on COVID, for instance, on vaccination, and it's very, very straightforward, very, very clear indeed from the evidence that poorer people who didn't have cars, were living in informal settlements were much less likely to get vaccines than were wealthier people. And wealthier people generally, on the whole, were more sceptical about the vaccines than people living in the informal settlements. So this is because of the way in which our society is organised at the moment in South Africa. And if we protest loudly enough, if we organise effectively, then we can begin to change these things, as has happened in the past. I mean, we spoke earlier about 2022, the workers were defeated then, and initially their conditions got worse, but they continued to organise, and over time they worked, partly because they were working with the government so closely, they did improve their conditions. So the key issue is organisation, mobilisation, the kind of demands you make, and the extent to which you can mobilise solidarity.
Professor Kate Alexander, what a pleasure it is to speak to you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to chat to us this morning. Professor Alexander is a Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. That's UJ, also author of Marikana, A View from the Mountain. Once again, Prof, thanks very much indeed.